Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So this is part 3 of my 1,000 subscriber Q&A videos that I've been uploading over the past week or so, because as of January 7th, this channel surpassed 1,000 subscribers and I solicited questions for an upcoming Q&A series. Now, as you are probably aware, I do get a lot of in-depth questions when I do these Q&A sessions, so I generally have to break them up in multiple parts. This is part 3. There's going to also be a part 4. So we're going to get right into the questions because we got a lot of questions asked, as you can imagine. First question. I would like to get your opinion on the higher end Pokemon sealed booster boxes, such as Skyridge or Neo Destiny. For example, back in June 2019, which is roughly 7 months ago, guys, Neo Destiny first edition booster boxes were selling for $8,000. Now they're going for around $16,000. This has happened with a lot of the boxes within the last 6 months where they have doubled in price in such a short time frame. Would love to hear your thoughts. Well, ironically, you probably already know what I'm going to say because you answered your own question in this particular question. You state specifically that back in June 2019, which I pointed out was literally roughly 7 months ago, a Neo Destiny first edition booster box was $8,000. Now it's selling for $16,000. Does that sound like a rational marketplace to you, where items are doubling in that short period of time? That gives me the heebie-jeebies. That tells me that market is inflated, it's hot, it's speculative, and it's also possibly being manipulated. So I would caution you, unless if you are not a established investor, meaning you don't have $250,000, $500,000 at your disposal, I would not advise you to chance $16,000 on an item like this, because you got to remember risk versus reward. Yes, that booster box could go up to $24,000. It could go up to $32,000. Heck, it could even go up to $50,000. But what most people aren't looking at, what happens if you go and buy a $16,000 booster box and the price falls to $12,000 and stays there? What if it drops to $10,000 and stays there? There's no guarantees, guys, in any of this stuff. Even the stock market, real estate markets, gold, crypto, it's all speculative to a certain degree. Now, when we look at financial markets and real estate markets, there's financial fundamentals that we can look and analyze those markets through the eyes of to understand what those type of assets should be selling for. Meaning there's a variance and a correlation there between the underlying asset value and what the price of the asset is. In the collectibles marketplace, in the cryptocurrency marketplace, this is all just fugazi. It's pretty much smoke and mirrors. If somebody wants to pay $16,000 for something, they can. It doesn't mean that that item's worth $16,000. So I would be very careful if I was getting into this market. I hope that answered it for you. Again, there's a chance you may take my advice and this booster box could go to $24,000 or $32,000. But I'm going to tell you honestly, can you afford to tie up $16,000? Let's start there, number one. And number two, are you okay if you tie up $16,000 and the item drops to $10,000 or $12,000 and stays there for the next 5 years? That's a decision that only you can answer. And based on what you provided me, the information in your question, I can't answer that part for you. I can just tell you that in my opinion, these markets are extremely speculative and a lot of them are being manipulated at present time. So be very careful if you play in this pool. Next question. Sean, what is your thoughts on stamp collecting? Well, I covered this in one of my videos I did where I talk about 5 collecting categories that are losing steam. Stamp collecting, unfortunately, is not on par with coins, traditional antiques, antique weaponry, antique furniture, antique glass, currency, any of those markets anymore. It used to be. Back in the 1970s, 80s, even the 1990s, stamp collecting was very strong. Now today, it pretty much waned a little bit to the point where there's not enough new collectors coming into the market to sustain it. So the problem is with stamp collecting, I don't see demand building for the average stamp that is out there on the market today. Unless if you're going after the top 1 to 5% of the market, maybe you can get away with going after the top 10% of the market. However, there is a possible catalyst that could change this. There's a lot of companies that are trying to come in and they want to offer third-party grading to stamps. I know the parent company of CGC and NGC is the Collectibles, Certified Collectibles Group. They are trying to launch, or they have launched, a company that does certify and grade postage stamps. I think if that catches on, that could be a very big catalyst to stamp collecting. But unfortunately, I don't see a lot of people out there getting too excited for stamp collecting again. So I'm hesitant to state that because there's a lot of caution in that particular marketplace right now. Stamps are not coins. Stamps are not currency. You have to understand that coins and currency are pretty much one of the most established collectible markets that are also part of the antiques trade that pretty much has been going strong for many, many years, even if that market at present time is in a bear market. So I don't think the prognosis for stamp collecting is good 10, 20, 30 years out. It's just my opinion. Again, we'll have to see what third-party grading does to that market. Maybe it will cause a catalyst, much like comic book collecting, and before you know it, stamp collecting will be back in the collector's eyes. But at present time, I would not enter that market if I was you. I would look to go into coins or currency or some other market that is more established and has a better track history over the last few years. Just my opinion. Next question. I would like to know in more detail your opinion of speculating or investing in IBM big box PC games, specifically the top 5 to 10% of the market. Well, first you should know I grew up with vintage video games and vintage computers. My first computer that I loved was the Apple IIc. I remember playing Mystery House, Transylvania, Bard's Tale, Bard's Tale 3, a lot of those games, even the original Ultima on my Apple IIc, and I loved it. Now, I did get into the IBM PC when the CD-ROM drive hit, roughly in 1992, 1993. I loved Seventh Guest, Alone in the Dark, Phantasmagoria. As you can probably guess, I am a huge survival horror fan, whether we're talking video games or computer games, so I loved all those games. The problem is, guys, most of those games, are readily available on Steam or other platforms. Be very careful if you are investing or collecting these items with a focus on long-term financial gains. A lot of the people that are being born after the year 2000 are not going to go after big box PC games. If anything, they're going to play 7th Guest, 11th Hour, Phantasmagoria through Steam and other methods. They're not going to want to go back, buy a 486 PC CD-ROM machine just so they can play some of these games. It's not going to happen. So the market right now is fairly strong. It has weakened a little bit. I think that people who are claiming that the market is heating up again aren't really looking at what it's done in the past. This market tends to ebb and flow a little bit. But overall, after the generation like me starts to age and we get in our 50s, 60s, 70s, I pretty much see this segment of the market cooling rather quickly. So it's not to panic yet. You have several years, if not a decade or more to go before this market does subsidize. But I just encourage you to use caution if you're going to put a lot of money into some of these games. For instance, I'll use this as an example. I love the game Mystery House for the original Apple II computer line systems. It was one of Sierra Online's first games ever created. Well, a mint or a complete in-box copy of Mystery House for the Apple II goes for roughly $1,000 to $1,500 on eBay. Now, I can easily afford to buy that game. The problem is, though, I don't see it as a good, valid long-term investment or even a good short-term investment. So I refuse to pay $1,000 or $1,500 for that game on eBay at present time, no matter how much of a nostalgic attachment I have to that particular item. As a kid growing up in Boyertown, my parents bought me an Apple IIc because I used to go to the Boyertown Elementary School computer lab every summer, and they had a copy of Mystery House there. They had a copy of Transylvania that I would play while I was supposed to be doing homework or what have you in that particular lab. Well, I love the game so much that I do want it, but it's just not worth me pulling the trigger at $1,000 or $1,500 at present time. So let that be a prime example of what I think of that particular market. Next question. I am French and I love your content. Thank you from across the pond. I was wondering if you had knowledge or opinions on any European or French collectible categories and whether they are sought after by Americans and other areas of the world. And do you think European Pokemon cards or similar collectibles can be sought after by the American market? Okay, let me answer your first question first. I'm sure that you have seen my videos on Rolex, on Hermes bags, where I talk about a lot of high-end luxury collectibles and how the market for them is very hot right now, especially in America. So that should answer your question that yes, European or British or overseas products of the luxury market are being consumed by Americans and people in other nations like well-to-do in China, Japan, even India. That being said, I am going to be doing more videos where I talk about high-end fashion and high-end luxury items that do come from Europe as well as France in other videos. So I'm not going to get too far into that topic on this particular Q&A, but what I will tell you is one of the best advantages you have if you do live in France or any part of Europe is the fact that you could get into antiques and you could literally go back thousands of years if you specialize in certain items. You know, one of the things I always laugh at when people talk to me about the antiques trade in America, they claim that the trade is so complex and hard to learn. And I talk to these people and I say, well, you know, you got to look at it from this perspective. America gained its independence from the British Empire in 1776. So when we talk about antiques from an American standpoint, we can really only go back in time 200, 240 years. Well, if you're in Great Britain or if you're in France, you guys mentioned the term antiques, you can go back thousands of years. So I always laugh when I have a fellow American like myself come to me and say, the antique market is so complex, I'm going to spend 5 or 10 years learning this market. And I sit there and look at him and I said, hey, it could be worse. You could live in France, you could live in Great Britain, where they can go back thousands of years. So what am I getting at? I would encourage you, if you are interested in any traditional antique categories, to start learning those categories, because you are very lucky to live in Europe and have that rich level of history where you can study some of these markets, whether we're talking about antique glass or antique furniture, where you can go back literally not just hundreds of years, but you can even go back to the coveted Middle Ages and you can start learning about these items, or even if you wanted to get into medieval weaponry. I know a lot of dealers of medieval weaponry that sell authentic items, or map dealers, people that deal in antique maps that are overseas that make a fortune dealing with that stuff because they specialize in those items, and they're easier to find in Europe because, again, you guys have thousands of years of history. So that may be something to consider if you do have an interest in those items. To answer your second question, do you think European Pokemon cards can be sought after by the American market? I really hate to say this and I don't want to dissuade you in any way. Pokemon cards are pretty much predominantly dominated by American cards and Japanese cards. So the European market may be strong in Europe. The problem is there ain't too many, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say ain't, aren't too many American collectors who collect European Pokemon cards, to my knowledge. Now, maybe there are more out there than I realize. It just seems to be, in my opinion, that the market for Pokemon cards is dominated either by the American market or the Japanese marketplace. So I hope that answers your question in full. If not, let me know in the comment section and I'll revisit it another time. I will give you more thoughts on this because it was a great question. Thank you so much. Sean, my question for you is, do you have an end game where you would sell all of your items and walk away? Well, one thing you got to understand, and I want to address this right now, I am going to be doing more videos where I talk about items that I'm buying at auction, or I show you guys coins or currency or historical artifacts that I won at auction and were either mailed to me or I picked up at the auction house, and I'm going to show them to you point blank in this house before they get put in either long-term storage or safety deposit boxes and the like. But the one thing that I will say, it's not that I have an end game, it's that in my mind, I separate out collecting categories and antique categories with moderate speculative items or mass-produced scarce items, and those are the items that I will flip first. For instance, I've said this before, I use short-term speculation to fuel long-term investments in the antiques trade. What I mean by that is, I have no problem buying amiibos or buying factory-sealed video games and flipping them for a profit on the secondary market. I take that profit and I go after rare coins, or I go after rare pieces of currency, or I go after historical documents, or collectible first edition books, or artwork. Even some of the stuff that you see behind me. I don't mind parting with some of this stuff. Like the Tiffany vase over there that's worth, what, $1,200, $1,300? That's not a rare vase. It's in near mint condition, and it's a piece of Tiffany glass. If I sold that tomorrow for a profit, I could easily go into the market and get another piece of Tiffany glass that's in near mint condition. It's not quote unquote rare. It's just a stable antique market. The same thing is true for the vintage Coke sign that most people haven't really commented on. That's in the wall behind me. That sign's valued at about $1,000. That's from the 1930s. It's a near mint, authentic Coca-Cola tin sign that I had framed just to preserve it. Well, an item like that is readily available on the secondary market. Now, they are becoming scarce and harder to find as time goes on because thanks to the American pickers that are pretty much interested in vintage advertising, that market shot up in value since the year 2010. There was a time when a sign like that would only cost $100, guys, believe it or not, or even $50. Today, that sign would be very hot at any vintage advertising auction, especially if it's run by Morphe's or a lot of the more specialty auction houses that cater to that collecting category. So it's not whether or not I have an end game, it's certain items I would be willing to part more than others. I've said this before. In an upcoming video, you're gonna see my latest heritage coin purchase that I got at the latest fun auction that just occurred this month, January 2020. And I paid something like $2,800 for the coin. I'm not gonna say what it is because I'm gonna do a video on that particular piece when it arrives. But that particular item is very scarce. I would not part with that for that reason. There's only so many that are graded in that condition. So it just depends on what the item is. If it's something like a video game or a vintage toy or even a comic book, I honestly don't mind parting with it if I'm gonna make a profit on it, where I can put that money into something that is more scarce and or truly rare in the antiques and collectibles trade. Those are the items I don't like to sell. So I hope that answers your question. Next question. A question I had was, what are some value killers that you know of in different markets? For example, in coin collecting, my understanding is that cleaning coins ruins the value. That is correct. Also, in wine collecting, my understanding is that if wine is not properly stored, it will ruin the wine, thus ruining the value. That is also correct. Well, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Every tangible asset that is of a collectible nature needs to be stored and maintained properly to hold its value or its collectability. So if we talk vintage toys, vintage comic books, coins, currency, antique glass, vintage advertising, movie posters, any category has certain risks to holding and storing those particular items long term. And I don't just mean risks of handling the item incorrectly or the item getting damaged or the item even becoming the victim of theft or fire. There's a lot of risks when it comes to antiques and collectibles. I am going to be releasing more videos on this topic over the next couple of months because I know a lot of people have been asking me to do a video on safety deposit box storage versus off-site storage versus something like RoboVault storage, which is a facility down in Florida. There's also Crozier Fine Arts, which is owned by Iron Mountain, that does high-end storage of artwork. So I am going to be doing a sole video on those particular topics coming up, where I will comment more on how certain antiques and collectibles should be stored, how to go out and choose either a safe or a safety deposit box, how to choose an off-site storage facility, if you do want to rent like a climate-controlled facility to store some of your pieces in that is outside of your house. We're going to talk more of that in depth. So I hope that helped you in that regard. There are certain risks that you have to understand if you're going to enter these markets. And again, when we hit that particular video, I'll touch on them in further depth. Again, we can go through every collecting category and talk about this as well. There's risks to anything that's tangible. There's risks to anything that's collectible. You have to understand, guys, one of the reasons that people like financial assets is because pretty much money in a brokerage account, you don't have to worry about somebody coming and stealing the physical assets that you have in a brokerage account. You don't have to worry if your house burns down if you lose the money you have in a brokerage account. Sure, there's always a hacking risk. There's risks in that nature. But overall, compared to antiques and collectibles, financial assets are so much easier to maintain. Let me just state that right up front. Next question. Where did you get the word Poindexter from? This is a great question, and I wanted to answer this at the end of this particular video because it kind of goes a little bit in depth. The term Poindexter was taught to me from some of my mentors in the antiques trade during the 1990s. A simple definition of a Poindexter is it's kind of a hipster who just follows trends. They have no understanding of economics. They have no understanding of finance. They have no understanding of the antiques and collectibles trade. They just go after the hottest new speculative market and chase after each subsequent speculative market. So right now there's a lot of people going after graded video games, vintage video games. I guarantee you, a lot of these guys never even entered the video game market before the last 5 years. They just saw the price gains and they latched onto it. It's no different than when Rudy premiered with Alpha Investments back in the end of 2015 or the beginning of 2016, whenever he premiered on the scene. There were a lot of people that were drawn to him that just thought, well, gee, he's teaching about investing in Magic the Gathering. I'm going to invest in Magic the Gathering. This is the type of person that today, while the reserve list pulled back 40 to 70%, this is the type of person that's contacting someone like me going, hey, I don't understand what happened here. How did I lose 40 to 70% of my money? What do I do with these cards? And I have to tell them, you entered a speculative market. You have to understand a lot of these markets are not stable. This is not an S&P 500 index fund. It's not a bank account. One of the things that I always hate when I hear collectors say, it's like putting money in the bank. I even apply that concept to coins. I hear a lot of coin collectors say, I'm going to pay $2,000 for this coin. It's like putting money in the bank. And I literally cringe every time I hear that. No, it is not. There are transaction costs if you go to sell an antique and collectible. You have to understand the marketplace. You have to choose the proper marketplace to sell into to maximize your value, lower your risks at auction, and also ensure you're not getting screwed by the auction company that you're consigning that item to. So there's a lot more risks when we talk about collectible assets than when we talk about other forms of assets, whether we're talking gold, silver, real estate, or financial assets. Yes, those markets are risky too, but in different ways. So a Poindexter is simply someone who follows a trend, who doesn't have any understanding of the fundamentals that's being applied to that particular market or collecting category that they're choosing to quote-unquote speculate or invest in. So I hope that answers your question. Now, the next question I got is very, very in-depth. I will cover some of these topics in this particular segment, and then some of these topics will also roll over into segment 4 of this 1,000 subscriber Q&A. So I'm just going to answer, and I'm going to read off this question and then answer it in full. At what point do you decide to enter an emerging speculative collecting market? Okay, I'm going to stop right there. The best way to enter a market like that, whether we're talking about Funko Pops, Beanie Babies, Nintendo Amiibos, is always at the beginning. You're able to understand that the product that's going to be hitting the market, and usually it's either the toy market or the collectible marketplace, you know that it has an element of mass-produced scarcity. You understand that going in, and you realize that you need to maximize your profits from the beginning. So you get into that market when the trend develops. Like Amiibos came out in November of 2014. I was buying into the craze immediately. I made a lot of money into that craze because I knew eventually that craze was going to end. And sure enough, by the year 2017, there weren't people waiting to pre-order the latest Amiibo anymore. The market had subsidized. Even today, there are some Amiibos that sell for, several times their original retail price. But if you bought into all the Amiibos and you have them all on a shelf, I guarantee you if you add up what you spent versus what you would spend selling the collection, shipping the collection to customers, eBay fees, managed payment fees, and the like, you would lose money. You really had to know which Amiibo to target, which is what I was really good at. So when the Amiibo craze hit, I went at it full force, but I didn't just buy any Amiibo out there. I looked at what individual Amiibos would pretty much be doing well on the secondary market, and that's what I targeted. For instance, at one time, I know I'm going to get hate for this, I had, 24 gold Nintendo Marios that I was selling on the secondary market for $70 or $80 a piece, because at that time, it was a Walmart exclusive. So I just had inroads where I could get those items and I could flip them. So the answer to your question is, it's always at the beginning when the trend is either emerging or starting to heat up. Second bit of advice I will give you is always have a written plan. Understand that you have to get out of the market at some point. You're not going to make a fortune in Amiibos over 10, 20, 30 years. It's just like what people are doing right now with Funko Pops. Right now, there's a lot of talk, well, some of these Funko Pops are losing value. And I said from the beginning, it's a very speculative market. Little Poindexter Jr. isn't going to care about Funko Pops just because Poindexter Sr. does. That's fool's thinking. It's just like little Timmy. Timmy Jr. doesn't care what Timmy Sr. collects. They're both, in my opinion, I hate to say this, idiots. So if you want to be a knowledgeable collector, it starts with being able to analyze markets, watch for trends, knowing when to get into a market, having a written plan, and being able to exit that market before the bottom falls out. One of the problems we had with Beanie Baby collectors is they were going after these items and they thought these items were going to go up in value every year. I have a video planned where I'm going to show you some of the forecasts that people thought Beanie Babies would be worth 10 years after their production. And it's a very interesting tidbit because it just tells you how speculators think. Today, if you would go back to those same speculators and say, hey, you thought this Beanie Baby that sold for $6 was going to be worth $1,000 in the year 2010, look at how wrong you were, they would deny it. I don't know what you're talking about, man. I just bought what I liked. I had a passion for it. Made a little bit of money in the beginning, and that's that. I'm not going to comment on that. You see what I'm meaning? Speculators tend to not learn from their mistakes. Don't be a speculator. You want to be an investor. If you choose to speculate short term as a result of that, that's fine. I do it. But you have to understand markets. Next question. If you had faith in an emerging speculative collecting market, what would be the portfolio percentage you would be willing to invest risk into it? Honestly, with Amiibos, I spent less than $5,000 and I was comfortable with that amount. So it's not so much a portfolio percentage. It's more of how I analyze the market and deem how much profit I can make from it. And I know this video is going to anger a lot of people because we're getting into the fundamentals of pretty much market manipulation, scalping, if you will. I know that's an evil term that's out there. It's really not accurate when you apply it to Amiibos and Funko Pops and all these other items. But I know there's a lot of people that have been coming in my comment section and accusing me of being nothing more than a big scalper. And I don't mind that. I take the criticism for what it is. But it's kind of obvious. I have a passion for this stuff. I mean, look at my house. Look at the stuff that I'm showing on camera. I mean, I do have a passion for these items. But to answer your question, it's not so much a percentage. It's understanding how much the asset costs and how much you can sell it for. When Amiibos came out, they were $12.99. So if you take $5,000 into that number, you're pretty much going to learn that I bought a lot of Amiibos over the years and I sold a lot of them for a profit. The stuff that you see upstairs, if you watch some of my earlier videos, I do film videos in my video game room. All those Amiibos were pretty much gotten free of charge because it was just stuff that I had left over in those collections when I pretty much cleared out my stock. I just kept some for myself, and that's pretty much where I got that collection. More on that in an upcoming video. Next question. I also love collecting screen prints and posters. I get the screen prints. Just be careful of the mass-produced scarce items at present time. If you're going to collect movie posters, I did a whole video on this many months ago when I launched this channel. Go after original first print posters from the 80s, 90s. If you have the money, go after the 70s, like Halloween. Movies that are iconic and have a lot of collectability and popularity. Go after posters in very fine or near mint condition or better. I actually would advise you to collect near mint posters if you're going to go after 80s posters because they're quite affordable. Go after posters that are listed on heritage auctions if you do want to collect movie posters. Don't go after any of these items that are limited run items or specially made for the collectibles market. That's all I'm going to say to that. Just be careful in those marketplaces. Again, if you are going to get into emerging speculative collecting markets, you have to have a plan. You have to get in at the beginning, and you have to understand how to analyze the trends. Because if you tie up $10,000 worth of product and the market bottoms out, you're going to lose a ton of money. And I know people that lost a lot of money in those markets. I have a video planned where I'm going to talk about Pez dispenser collecting back in the 1990s because that market was very speculative. And I know a lot of people that lost a ton of money speculating in that market where I went in, I bought what I wanted, I pretty much took the profit and left right away. And there were a lot of people that hated me back then because they said, well, you're not a legitimate Pez dispenser collector. You don't care about this stuff. You just care about the money. And I looked right at them and I said, you're absolutely right. This market is not going to last. Today, Pez dispenser collecting is pretty much dying. A lot of high-end auction houses won't even take most vintage dispensers anymore. It's just a sad way it is, guys. Collecting categories do die out. As much as you want to believe it's the next big thing, ironically, it usually isn't. And I hate to say that because I'm going to be ending the video there on a negative note, but just be careful in some of these markets. Thank you for watching. Please consider liking or subscribing this video to this channel and or this video. If you do have any feedback for me, let me know in the comment section. And part 4 of this particular series will air soon. Thanks, guys.